where is the money in games, in the sense that we spoke about multiple, like one is the consoles, right? Like the way I'm thinking about this is, so there is consoles, there is PC. We'll talk about cloud gaming in a bit, but I mean, there's cloud gaming, and then there is obviously mobile gaming
Yeah.
in your app store. So in the sense, like, where is the most money two, I think, two threads here. So one is just popularity, like what is most popular with the audience,
Mm.
and is that where also the money is, like,
Mm.
could it be that console is very popular with the audience but money is not there to be
Yeah.
made, but money may be on the app store but it's not very popular. So like, in
Yeah.
terms of economics, how is that? Like, can you paint a picture there?
I would probably think about it slightly differently, right? Like think about it like a stack, right? So when you're really trying to think about what's the value chain of the games industry, right? It really starts with the hardware, which really makes all of this possible, right? As you articulated, you have your PCs, you have your consoles, you have your mobile phones, and you have your cloud platforms, which are sort of emerging right now. The bulk of value in the games industry is captured by what I like to call gaming content, right? So which really encapsulates all the gaming formats, all the way from your hyper casual games, all the way to your 4x RPG shooter games, etc. That's really the gaming content business, which is what generates most of the revenue. There are other aspects of players in the games industry who are important stakeholders. So, for example, you have your gaming hardware layer, and then you have your content layer, which is really built on top. But then you also need distribution layers, right? So, for example, in the case of the mobile devices, it is really the app stores, right? You have Google Play and the iOS App Store, which are really the gatekeepers for mobile audiences to really capture or find, discover, and install games. And they end up capturing quite a substantial degree of value at a much higher profit margins because they don't really make games, and they're just sitting at the gate and capturing 30% of all transactions that sort of happen there. This also happens in the PC and the traditional video console games industry, where if you want to buy an Xbox games, you probably need to buy it from the Xbox store, or same for PlayStation. And on PC, that place is dominated by players like Valve or Epic Game Store, right? So these distributors are quite an important sort of player who really drives how consumers discover these applications. But ultimately, a lot of the true
I'm so
value is
sorry.
captured by gaming content.
I'm
Yeah,
so sorry. So just to make sure that I understood that, in I think on mobile I understood where you have, let's say if I'm a game creator and if I've created a game, I go
yeah,
to App Store or the Google Play Store.
yeah.
Now whenever, if you want to buy that game, if it's 10 rupees, I will pay 3 rupees to Apple because they are hosting that game, and
Right.
so
I
they take the
guess a
three
bit
rupees
more
cut.
nuanced than that. So, for like I mentioned before, right, most of the games which are published on mobile devices are actually free, and that really follows the freemium business model, which we should talk about in a while. The whole idea is that games distributed on mobile specifically are mostly free. You don't really need to pay anything to install these games, right? It's all free. You just go to the Play Store, you see tens of thousands of game at this point of time, and you can install these games without really paying anything upfront, right? So there is no real cost involved in installing a game. What is challenging is two things, right? Like how do you capture value from a user afterwards? And generally that happens through two things. One is microtransactions, which are in-app purchases that a user can actually do once they start playing the game, or by the virtue of advertising, by showing users who have installed your game various forms of advertisement within the game, right? Now platforms make money by taking a percentage cut of every single transaction that happens within these games, right? So for example, let's say you are playing Fortnite and you want to buy this character skin and it costs $10, and you spend $10 on the mobile app in order to buy it, you will have to pay 30% of the transaction to Apple or Google as platform fees, right? And they take that money under the presumption that they are taking care of payment and processing and reconciliation, etc. But they're really what's really happening is they're leveraging their platform power, right? They have captive users. Users do not have a choice on an iOS device to go and install a game from another Play Store. You have to go on the Apple Play Store, and they determine which are the games which will eventually get listed and how those games will be discovered to the user, right? So they're really leveraging that platform power, and they are able to generate value from the underlying games industry. So if you, in fact, a very interesting one to look at would be the Epic Games versus Apple lawsuit, which went on in the last couple of years. And an interesting statistic that came out was that more than 70% of all money made by all apps by Apple in the App Store economy really comes from games, because Apple cannot capture this value of taking a cut from every transactions on any other sort of medium like an e-commerce or ride sharing where there is a physical exchange of goods or service happening. They are able to eke this value or extract value from games because they really purely on digital goods, right? So games do not really sell any physical good to the customer when they are getting a consumer to pay for something. They're generally selling swords or skins, which are really just digital goods, right? And Apple's view is that they need to take a value out of each of those transaction, and they're basically printing money just by doing that.
So I have one question. This is a dumb question, which this is a dumb question, but I'm not able to understand this properly. I got a little confused when you said. So if I'm on Fortnite and I buy a skin, and let's say it's $10, Apple will take, let's say, $3 from that. I
Yeah,
understood that the logic is, Fortnite is selling something in Fortnite is selling something in the game, and they want to take a cut when
yeah,
they make that purchase.
yeah,
Where I'm lost a little bit is when I'm thinking about Amazon, and Amazon is also on the App Store, and then
yeah,
let's say I buy shoes,
yeah,
cost me, let's say, 3,000 rupees.
yeah.
Um, why is not Apple taking the
Taking
three
cut.
30%?
Yeah,
Yeah, because it feels like it's the same. Like I'm not. It feels like it's the same thing. They're selling products, but
yeah,
on one case they're taking a cut. I'm not
yeah.
able to understand that actually.
It feels like an inconsistent rule that is applied across, and that's really behind a lot of contention by all these digital good suppliers, right? So if you look at the categories where the apps themselves do not have to pay this platform fees, as categories like e-commerce, for example, your Flipkarts, Amazons of the world, you don't need to do that. You don't pay that when you're using Uber, for example, in order to book a cab or a ride, right? Because according to Apple's own definitions, there is a physical exchange of good that happens when you're buying a shoe or buying a product from Amazon, or you're actually hiring a service in the physical world when you're trying to rent a cab through their platforms. But you would notice that if you had to actually buy Amazon Prime on the Amazon app, you can't do that. You have to actually go to your website to do that because that's a purely digital transaction that is happening right now. And that is this is purely a rule that is created by Apple. And then the real question to ask is, okay, which are all the categories where pure digital transactions happen, right? And that is really gaming, media and social, which is your music streaming, OTT streaming, content streaming, and then your dating and other sort of social media applications, right? And all of these three categories of applications are the ones who are taxed with this additional 30%, and money generated from them entirely subsidizes Apple's one of the most profitable business units, which is their App Store business, right? So that the entire value that is transacted on the App Store is roughly above $1 trillion, according to Apple, with the recent note that they had released. But most of the revenue that they generate from this business is made by taxing these purely digital goods operated microtransactions.
So is that a huge? I mean, is that a huge problem for the revenues of the gaming? I think I'm stating the obvious here, but it does feel like it's a huge
Yeah.
chunk of the revenues and
Absolutely.
profits
Right.
from
So
the.
I think it's important to sort of like look back at and think about why did this system sort of like come into place in the first place, right? So and that's probably something that we didn't talk about. If you look at the early 2000s and how games were distributed before these app stores itself happened, right? You would have to actually create a physical disk. You'd have to have some amount of cost to sort of like create that disk. You have to distribute them in physical stores like GameStop or your nearest sort of electronic retailer. You have to get a physical disc there, and then the sale itself has to happen somewhere at $60. User will spend that money, buy that disc. So developer itself would capture a smaller share of the overall transaction, right? Now the App Store itself came to existence roughly, I think, 2008 or 2009, if I'm not wrong, after the launch of the iPhone itself, and in-app purchases happened in 2009-10, right? Now, when game developers were looking at mobile as a platform, they realized a couple of things, right? One is, here is an entirely new device, which is exactly like a console, but something that a user carries around all the time. And what it also means is just TAM expansion, right? You are no longer limited to selling games to people who are owning a console. You could theoretically sell a game or distribute a game to practically anyone who has a mobile phone, right? So that is a big enough positive shift that happened because of these app stores and because of the mobile platforms for the game developers themselves. So they moved in en masse, right? Tons and tons of game developers started coming in the early 2010s, really started making these games. And I guess at this point of time, there are tens of thousands of mobile developers having their games on these platforms. Now, they are happy, they were early on happy to pay the 30% fee to Apple, because they were unlocking a completely new total addressable market, right? That market did not exist before, and they were able to grow at a very, very fast rate, right? So everybody was quite happy because a massive distribution got unlocked, clear captive consumers don't have anywhere else to sort of go to, and this was a very easy way to distribute games to users, right? So this changed the paradigm of the past, where only large publishers with distribution networks could actually get games to various parts of the world. Now anybody who can actually create the core game content can go to Google Play or Apple Play Store and upload the application there, and then once you sort of like pass through the hurdles, you can game the game accessible to everyone. That was not possible for it. So I'm just talking about the pros of why this was really interesting for game developers, and why the gaming ecosystem itself sort of like start growing up, right? Where it started getting challenging is, a, obviously you are paying 30% of whatever you make to Apple just for sort of the pleasure of hosting their games on their platforms. But beyond that, there were other headwinds because of which the overall profit margins in the industry started getting compressed, right? One is just the increase in supply, right? More and more games started getting made because technology became easier. More and more people started seeing this opportunity. So the volume of games itself started going up, right? So then the challenge becomes not the content creation. So cost of content is going down over a period of time. Of cost of creating content is going down over a period of time. Then the cost essentially shifted to cost of distributing these games. How do I get my customer to know that my game exists? How do I get the customer to install my game in a sea of tens of thousands of games, right? So in the early 2000s, what ended up happening was mobile game developers really took on performance based advertising as the primary way that they're distributing games, right? So they started running ads across multiple other games in order to acquire users. Now, very recently, I'm not sure if you have followed the news, Apple made a change on how the users are tracked in their devices for the sake of privacy. It's called the IDFA changes, and I'm sure somebody talked about it in the past. Now that change fundamentally shifted on how games itself can be distributed through effective advertising, because targeting infrastructure was completely broken by Apple, right? So because Apple controls distribution, because Apple controls the physical hardware layer of the user, and because Apple controls the publishing layer, and on top of that they're taking 30% cut, so their already hurt margins are hurt even further because their distribution also started becoming more and more complicated, right? So to your question, obviously yes, right? Developers are pinched on both sides right now. The platforms are really extracting value in a monopolistic fashion, and there are active lawsuits going on across the globe. There is a lawsuit going on in the US. There are multiple lawsuits open in the European Union, where cases are being contested to sort of repeal these charges placed by these app stores.
Uh, so I was not very clear when you mentioned the I think the app tracking transparency changes.
Yes.
So let me tell you. So let me give you an idea of what I understood from that. Where I'm coming from is like when these changes like affect Facebook. Let's say the way so Facebook tracks users not only while they are in the app, but also I think they
Yes.
get some data as to which app
Correct.
I think the which app the other which app I'm using otherwise
Yes.
as well, even when I'm not using Facebook.
Yep.
So it tracks our behaviors, and then it can serve as ads which might be most relevant to me. So if I'm going to,
Correct.
let's say, some shoe app, maybe Facebook will show me some shoe advertisements on Facebook. I'm
Yeah.
not very clear how. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on how this affects gaming? Because I'm not very clear how would
Sure.
like.
Yeah, we can probably just talk briefly about how this infrastructure works, right? So let's start with the example of a game which is currently made out. I have a game which is completely ready to ship, and now I have to find audience, right? So who? Now the question is, how do I find audience who would probably find my game interesting and would be playing that game, right? Now the obvious way to do this is you can say that, okay, I'm going to do traditional marketing. I'm going to buy TV ads. I'm going to buy billboards, OH, a lot of things that you could generally do, but you realize that they are probably not really worth my money because I'm a mobile app business, and unless a user can actually do an action to install my app, my marketing spend really doesn't mean much, right? So obviously a lot of these game developers got gravitated to performance marketing, right? So performance marketing is this idea where I am spending money on these ad networks globally, which are Google and Facebook being the largest networks of users globally, which you can sort of advertise to. Find users who would be relevant and interested in playing my game, and then go and acquire them, right? So they start running these campaigns and then start spending money, right? Now what happens is, I create my ad copy, I create my ad creatives, and then I go to these ad networks and say that, hey, help me find 10 users who are already playing my game, find me 10 similar users and show my ad to them, right? Now Facebook is extremely good at this because a, they have like 2 billion users data. They have an extensive audience network, and they are very easily able to find lookalike audience. For example, if they have me as a user and I am a person who has already spent in a game, they can create a profile of me, figure out my attributes of why I am playing that game, why I'm spending that game, and then help this app developer find 100 other users who would potentially sort of fall under that definition, and then show ads only to them, right? So you're not spreading and spraying and praying your ads like traditional TV formats. Your ads are extremely targeted, right? So that is what is driving the advertising efficiency. Because if an ad is extremely targeted, I can click on that ad and I can install that ad, and I don't need to show thousands of ads. Maybe I only need to show 100 ads, right? So that is the advertising efficiency which Facebook and Google were phenomenally good at. The challenge with the app tracking transparency framework that came in was that Apple basically broke the infrastructure through which the users were identified, right? So the every individual user, when you're using a mobile phone, you have a unique device identifier. In the case of Apple, it's called IDFA, right? So that's a unique device identifier that you have. And in the case of Google also, you have something called a GAID, right? So think of it like your roll number or your primary key, which sort of identifies you as that user, right? What basically Apple said was, hey, you know what, you can no longer have access to this privacy, this ID, this personal ID that you have, and you can no longer target a user based on that personal information unless the user gives you explicit consent to do that, right? So whenever you install new applications in iOS or these devices, you would see a pop-up that is coming up. Ask app, this app is asking to track your information. So do you press ask the app not to track, or you just press cancel, right? Now, obviously, users are becoming more and more privacy conscious because of all the issues that are happening. So they're increasingly opting not to track, right? Now, what this means is your advertising efficiency starts dropping, right? You are finding it harder and harder to find lookalike audience because you can no longer deterministically say that this user came in from channel A, spend X dollars, and I'm able to generate Y dollars from them. That deterministic attribution model is completely broken because I can no longer attribute $1 spent to $1 gained or one install achieved, right? So that is essentially what changed in the advertising ecosystem. And entire businesses were built, large gaming businesses were built purely by driving this arbitrage, right? Purely by being able to identify users specifically and targeting ads to them. Many gaming businesses over the last 10, 50 years got made in using that infrastructure and build on top of that. And now increasingly they are finding it harder to target these users and service the right sort of ads to them. So they're finding it essentially harder to distribute their games. Right. Now this manifests in two ways. One is their cost of consumer acquisition starts going up. Right. I have to spend more dollars in order to find a user who would be relevant and then coming and playing my game because it's just harder to do. Right. Now, ultimately, you make money from a unit economic perspective if I am spending less than what I will make from a user. Right. Your CPI, your cost per install, needs to be lower than the LTV of a user. Right. Now, as I described in the case of freemium
What
games,
is LTV?
lifetime value of a user, right? The money
Okay.
that a game generates over a period of time that the user actually plays this game, right? So your CPI side of this equation is now started going up, right? LTV is anyway hard because, like I previously said, if it's a game is free, most people won't spend money in the game, right? So 99% of the users will probably never spend a dollar even if you're continuing to play the game, right? And that is perfectly fine as long as these game developers are able to find that 1% of audience who will spend, who will pay, and they will continue to serve content to them, and they will keep on engaging in the game over a long enough period of time. I think that's the core thesis under which a lot of these companies operated, and the key headwind right now is that that infrastructure is currently broken, right? It's just they're just finding it harder to distribute games.
So, I mean, what happens next? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where the industry is right now, right? So few things happened. Broadly, large publishers have started slowing down new game releases because they just don't know how to sort of distribute these games, and what has worked in the past 5 to 7 years has suddenly sort of started shifting right now, and there is a bit of uncertainty in the market if you look at the new game releases. The second key thing that publishers are doing is they are returning back to basics, right? They want to create games which already have an existing distribution advantage, right? Either by virtue of an IP. For example, if I make a Marvel game, I am likely to be shown in the App Store. People know the Marvel game and they are more likely to install that game, right? So using tactics like IP or creator influencer integrations within your game so that you can reduce the chances that your game will not be discovered, is what developers are trying to do, right? So they're essentially trying to de-risk this performance marketing based leverage which just went away, and trying to find these alternate ways through which games can be gotten to customers. So there's a lot of active work that's going on there, but so far we don't have clear answers on how things will work out, right? Now work had already, so the games industry, I think one thing that we probably should talk about is how the LTV itself started getting optimized over a period of time, right? So LTV is the lifetime value from a user. Now I think a natural question that a lot of people ask is, hey, how does freemium games generally make money, right? Because you're not paying $60 upfront in order to buy this game, and most people do not spend any money, right? uh, then how do those businesses make enough money to sort of cover for all this advertising spend and production spend, right? uh, they are able to achieve that by just retaining 5 to 7% of people after a month of acquisition, right? So if 100 people install a game on day one, more than 90% of them wouldn't be playing the game at the end of the month. They would have uninstalled the game, they would have moved on to something else, right? The real value gets unlocked when that 5 to 10% of people who continue to play that game continue to play that for a very long period of time, right? So you want to find people for whom the product is just right. It just fits in the right corners within your day. It just fits in those right moments where I can just keep making that into my daily habit, right? So the entire gaming industry is currently in pursuit of finding that highly committed player audience and sustaining them over a period of time by just giving them a non-stop stream of content, right? So if you're playing any of these modern games, you would notice that the content is no longer static. It's no longer this single player story where I come in and there is a story and the game ends. There is a non-stop stream of events. There are tournaments going on. There are things, special collectibles to do. There are events that are themed across public holidays. There are character crossovers. There is new things to do, right? So the game is always fresh. There's always more and more things to do, and this is really borrowing a leaf from the playbook of the traditional media content, right? You just have to keep releasing new content, new movies, new TV shows. Pretty much that is happening in the games industry as well over the last 5 to 10 years, and that's called the live service business model, right? uh, Now these developers are just focusing after the release of the game on creating more and more content and consistently serving their audience base so that they can extract more and more lifetime value from them.
What about? I mean, we spoke about Apple's changes, but isn't there some more juice to be squeezed out of Google Play Store? Maybe in terms of the even they have a lot of users using their
Correct.
platform, right? And I don't think they have implemented the privacy
Correct. Yeah, I mean, Google.
restrictions.
So I think broadly the trend is that even Google is going to be more forward in implementing positive privacy changes for the user. Now, to be clear, right, privacy changes are great for the user, right? The user is essentially provided agency to say, hey, I don't want to be tracked across the internet. I don't want to be specifically targeted for specific advertisements, which could make me lose money, right? So that's a consumer surplus thing to be done. Uh, but clearly, Google is also going in that direction, and I think their cookie deprecation is also coming up very soon. So I think the reality is that across Google and iOS, the privacy changes are here to stay, and it is something that developers will have to get comfortable with, right? The other important thing to think about is, even though Google devices are much more larger in terms of volume, the paying customers are highly concentrated on the iOS devices, right? They are pricey devices. They are people who have the spending power, and you would realize that even though the download share is skewed in the favor of Google, the overall revenue share is skewed in the favor of iOS, right? So the money making users are in iOS, unfortunately. And ultimately, for a game to be truly successful globally, you have to make that work.
Right, and I think even in terms of pricing as well, I think that there will be some differentiation. Even if it's the same game, I think Android users or iOS users might have that pricing disparity. No.
Yeah, so I think it goes a couple of layers deeper than that, right? I think at this point in time, like I previously said, right, live operations has really become the crux of the industry. Now, live operations is the process of creating this content nonstop, but it also is about creating the right set of features and the right personalization for the users to a degree that is not possible in other entertainment formats, right? So, for example, the offer that is offered to you is never going to be seen by me to make that same purchase, right? So now the technology has evolved to a point where every single customer is served the content to be purchased according to the state that they are in, how much characters that they've collected in the game so far, how much amount of progress they've made. how much is their willingness to spend basis what device that they are using, which country that they are using, and depending on how their behavior has been in the past, right? So the personalization has expanded to a point where it's not just about the core gameplay experience, but it's also about the way that these games are monetized, right? So for example, a high value iOS user generally wouldn't see a lot of ads as much as you would think, even though showing an ad to an iOS user is likely more profitable. They don't want to show ads and provide them free rewards because they know that they have a higher likelihood of converting that iOS user into becoming a spending user, right? So the extremely high degree of personalization happens not just from iOS to Android perspective, but across every single user bases their gameplay pattern, right? So I think it's important to call out the progress that India has made in terms of achieving this live operations competency, right? Releasing this content in an extremely efficient fashion over a period of time, identifying the right consumer behavior according to what the players are doing within the game, and then serving personalized content accordingly. And it's a huge engineering and content infrastructure problem. But in India, the talent base is already there. If you look at companies like Zynga or EA, which have been in operations in India for the past 20 years, they're already managing more than 200, $300 million of PNL within India over the course of the past few years, right? Even though the games themselves haven't been made in these studio locations, they have already gained their expertise in building these systems, personalization, and serving content over live operations, right? So that is a talent that I really believe will drive a lot of the incremental new games development, because that talent has been groomed and trained by the global standards, and they are now ready to take on newer challenges that are coming up.
I wanted to move on to console economics and maybe, but before we get into that, is there anything that we forgot to bring up in the economics of mobile gaming?
I think we talked a lot about the challenges that mobile gaming is currently facing right now in terms of the various pressures of platform and distributing these games itself. But I think it's important to sort of reflect on just how profitable a business it will be when you sort of get it right, right? You The production of a lot of these games off the bat is not extremely costly, especially on the casual side of games, right? Making a mastery game is not likely to be an extremely costly endeavor. You'd probably spend somewhere less than $5 million to get the game out the door, right? But if you're able to get things right, if you're able to get organic virality going, if you're able to get the retention right, the profits that you can generate is just disproportionate, right? So I want to call out a couple of businesses which are very interesting for people to look at. For example, Supercell, and I'm sure a lot of people have already played Supercell games, the Clash Royale, Clash of Clans, Boom Beach, Heyday, etc., are made by Supercell. Now that team, the entire team size is probably not more than 40 members, right? Now their games cumulatively make more than $5 billion in a year. So you are able to effectively generate an extraordinary degree of profit uh, by if you're able to sort of just get this core mechanic and formula right within the mobile gaming industry, right? The cost of content production is an order of magnitude lower than what you would need in console and traditional PC businesses. So they can become extremely large businesses extremely fast, right? So if you're able to get it right, you could potentially become a $1 billion company very, very fast, much more faster than most other businesses could ever possible to achieve.
But it's very difficult to like get it right.
Absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, if anything is worthwhile, I'm sure it's not going to be easy. So